Welcome to the Chiefs. The Chiefs is a Whiteark podcast aimed at specifically giving you an insight into what makes great leaders and entrepreneurs in a variety of organisations tick. We call them Chiefs. My name is James Ciuffatelli, and together with my Whiteark co-chief, Joe Hands, we're going to attempt to take you on a journey and talk to as many chiefs across as many industries as we can to give you an insight into A, what makes them tick, and B, what makes their enterprises thrive, and more importantly, what they've learnt along the way. The Chiefs.
Well, this is our second episode of The Chiefs. My name is Joe Hands, a director of Whiteark, and I'm so excited today to have with me Charlie Nelson from ForeseeChange.
Yes, Joe. Hello. I've been forecasting for, I think it's nearly 50 years now, and interested in the future that whole time as well. And we advise clients about changing consumer trends, their spending power, and just how the world's generally changing for their business.
And what an interesting time at the moment, Charlie. I mean, after being forecasting for 50 years to hit something like COVID-19 that no one saw coming, a really interesting time for your clients and all companies to work out what does this mean for them.
Yes, it is. I've never seen anything quite like this year over that 50 years. We knew that there was a pandemic coming sometime or other because they do come around every 30 or 50 years. The worst was the Spanish flu, of course, but there have been some in the meantime. But this is very different because we've decided to close sections of the economy and put restrictions on people. And that's what we'd never experienced before. And it makes it very hard to predict what's going to happen during this period and after it. We've been fortunate in having access to quite a range of surveys of consumers over this period of time, starting back in April and through to September. So we've got some feeling for how consumers' mindsets have changed and may change in the future.
Yeah, and I think, everyone, whether you're a consumer, a customer, or, a business owner or someone in a business, it's a really uncertain time, right? It's something that, we'll never experience again in our life. And to your point, while there may have been other pandemics, the fact that we have shut components of the economy and the government stimulus packages and some of the things that have gone in, it's kind of unprecedented in terms of really knowing what this means.
It is. There's no doubt about that. People have changed over the past 6 months. People have been on something of a roller coaster ride where the pandemic started and we shut down parts of the economy and we had restrictions. And so in April, people were very concerned and anxious and frustrated and to some extent a bit bored, working from home and their life being very different. Then in May, as we opened up some industries because we seemed to have COVID moderately under control, the mood of the consumer improved dramatically. But with the second wave starting in Melbourne during July, then people have gone back to being anxious and they're concerned about being a carrier and the economy and their personal finances and not being able to see family and friends. So there's a lot of things on people's minds. They're still optimistic about their own future.
Yeah.
But their optimism about the future of Australia is more balanced with pessimism. And when it comes to the world at large, they're basically pessimistic about the world.
I suppose with change and uncertainty, people react in different ways. And I get that kind of uncertainty because there is this level of uncertainty about what does this actually all mean and, what's this going to mean for me personally, but also what's this going to mean for the economy and what's the flow-on impact on my kids and on the next generation.
Absolutely. And some things haven't gone away, by the way. I mean, we asked people in a September survey, what are your concerns and hopes for the future? And of course, there was a lot of mentions of COVID-19 and vaccine, hope for a vaccine, and of course, their personal finances and their employment prospects and the economy. But also mentioned quite a lot was climate change. Concerns about climate change haven't gone away. That is still there.
Yeah.
And also concerns about the world more generally. Some of the leaders in the world aren't inspiring a lot of confidence.
A good point. And it's something you touched on just before, and I just thought around this whole mental health, right? And I think, we haven't yet seen really the impact that we know that it has impacted people's mental health. We know that companies are worried about what it means for their employees and have been putting strategies in place to really work out how to kind of help manage their employees. But as an overall kind of ecosystem, you know, the real impact from a mental health perspective on this pandemic and the impact flow on of that life is never going to be the same. It's going to be very interesting to see what the fallout is on that.
Yes, it is. And it depends how long it goes on for as well, of course, which we don't fully know yet. There's concerns about mental health and other illnesses, which during the shutdowns, people haven't necessarily sought the medical assistance that they actually need. And so some conditions could be getting worse and therefore creating, you know, worse ongoing problems for them.
Yeah, and I know there's been some stuff in the paper and that I've read around, as an example, you know, cancer patients haven't necessarily been going in and having their chemo treatments and they're worried about going to the hospital. But yeah, there's going to be a long-term or even medium-term impact of people dying from things that they wouldn't have died from if it wasn't for COVID because they would have got the treatment.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. A close friend of mine is quite sick and, you know, there are some really good services out there like chemo at home and things where they can actually bring people to the house. And it seems like there isn't a widespread acceptance by some of the specialists of some of those services. And so people are having to change specialists to be able to actually get chemo at the home, even though the health funds are accepting of it. And it's a little bit off topic, but it's kind of an important thing in my mind because I feel like, you know, the specialists should be doing everything they can to really be supporting their patients during this time.
Yes, it's difficult for some people, for example, who can't travel across a border to see their specialists. So there's plenty of issues like that are worrying people. I think that what we've observed in terms of consumer spending during this period is a move towards the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That is concern about food, and their home, their shelter. And it's more about those needs rather than the wants that we used to have. And people have spent a lot of money on food and home cooking. The liquor stores are doing very well indeed. And also the furniture stores, the electrical and electronic stores, they're doing very well as people work on their nest, work on their home office. And so there's been a tremendous boom in spending in those areas, whilst at the same time there's been a lot less spending on clothing and eating out, of course.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And, you know, because of the government stimulus package, there's also been quite an inflow of income. And in some cases, people making more income than they had made. But it's kind of an artificial inflation of the economy and that kind of thing. And what are you seeing, Charlie, in terms of people saving? And are they saving? And what's kind of the profile of what that looks like?
There's a very great deal of saving. If people had a spare $1,000, 540 would be saved. That's based on the September survey. And a further nearly 200 would be used to repay debt.
Yeah.
And another 150 odd would be going on household bills, which leaves about 120 for discretionary spending. So that's very different to what we've seen before the pandemic. Saving has gone up dramatically.
Yeah.
Loan repayment has gone down a lot because of much lower interest rates.
Yeah.
And spending has gone down.
Yeah, and I think, you know, thinking about this whole saving thing, it's this uncertainty factor, right? People don't know when we're gonna get a vaccine for COVID, when the world's gonna go back to normal. People's retirement savings have been impacted, their superannuation or their investments have been impacted by the market volatility, and so they're just really trying to protect their future back to this Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
They are. There's a lot of precautionary saving there. But one bright spot is that there's a lot of saving for a first home. We've got a unique combination of circumstances with very low interest rates, less inflation in house prices. The peak was in 2017 and it's a few percent lower than that. There's also, of course, a government program to assist people, 10,000 places a year. A new round has just been announced so that people can get into a home with only 5% deposit.
Yeah.
And people know that this is their best chance that they're probably ever going to get in their life to get into that first home. So there's a tremendous amount of saving amongst people who rent and who are living with parents to get into that first home.
Yeah, which is good from an overall economy
Oh,
perspective,
yes.
right? Like, it's a really good sign. And the fact that they're making the barriers for people from a deposit perspective easier, and you're right, the low interest rates helps too.
And also, people have been able to access their superannuation.
Yes.
And this is an opportunity, again, a once only opportunity for people who might be wanting to get into a first home to get $10,000 or $20,000
Yeah.
to add to their deposit.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it, on that whole pulling money out of superannuation? And I know I read an article a month ago, might not have been right, Charlie, but it was about the amount of people who are actually spending it on plastic surgery. But it might have been a funny article that the plastic surgeons were using to advertise their services. But I just thought it was a funny article. But you're right. I mean, what an opportunity to be able to pull the 20 grand out, and actually be able to use it now for something that will help you build wealth for the future, like a home deposit.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And thinking about, I suppose, some of the things that we've been chatting about, what have you seen in terms of unemployment and, that kind of sentiment in the market around jobs, and, what are you seeing in different states where maybe they're a bit more progressed than Victoria?
There are big differences. Obviously, Victoria's in the worst situation employment-wise or unemployment-wise because of the big second wave, which we're hopefully coming towards the end of. 8 new cases announced this morning. So there are big differences there. Western Australia is probably the least affected, although of course they've closed their borders and tourism's down there. So it is a national problem, and people are clearly concerned about that. We found that there's basically 5 groups of people, and one of those is safety seekers, those who want to stay safe and stay in their local cocoon, so to speak. The strugglers who are struggling financially, and that's about 20% of people. And what that means is that it's consistent with the fact that if you add together unemployment and underemployment, you get to close to 20. Underemployment is people who have got a job but want to work more hours. So we've got about 20% of people who are quite seriously affected one way or another. We've also got people who just want to get back to normal.
Yeah.
That's about 20% of the population also that just want to get back to normal. And in between, we've got people who are taking the opportunity to think about what's important to them. A slow life for some people, or there's opportunities perhaps to keep my job, work from home, but I can choose where my home will be. And so I can stay away from the CBD.
It's interesting, isn't it, Charlie, this whole, prior to COVID, this whole we're flexible, you can work from home, and that whole people have had to work from home, and now it's become a new norm. And what's this new world going to look like for property, for where people live? And we're already seeing trends in relation to, it doesn't actually matter if you live in Melbourne or Sydney or wherever you live anymore, because actually you can do your job remotely.
That's right. You can live at your newly acquired beach house or in the country if you want to, and maybe you might need to go into the office occasionally for a meeting. So if you're near a good train service, well, yes, we can do that.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I think you mentioned before around, in terms of these 5 different groups, so the safety seekers, who I think you said were like 26%, they're the largest group. And then you've got the strugglers, the opportunists, the opportunists who are rethinking and resetting what their life could look like.
They're excited about things because they've got an opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
Whereas the simplifiers are saying, well, look, we need to sort of think about what's important to us, and maybe that's just finding ourselves a slow life in our local community, and that's important to us rather than the life we used to have.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's made the whole COVID thing has made people reassess their priorities.
Definitely.
And to your point earlier around the Maslow hierarchy of needs, things that were kind of a given are now actually really important, and that security factor and protecting your, I suppose, family and friends from the health, but also the flow-on impact of what this means from an economic perspective.
Yes, it's a big change. To some extent, it's been going on for a while. So the habits that people have developed over this 6 months or so, and the thinking they've gone through means that these changes are going to stay with us for a while.
Well, yeah,
Like,
they are going to stay with us for a while. And, and even to your point, I mean, even if when we do get a vaccine, whenever that is and what that looks like, I mean, until then, we're in a suppression strategy state.
mm,
If I was somebody who went to the movie every weekend because I like
mm,
going to the movies, but, I'm not saying I won't go to the movies when the world opens up, but I probably won't go every weekend, and I'll be a bit more cautious about when I go out and where I go out, and
yes,
maybe focus on going and seeing my family and friends rather than doing a whole lot of outings that I may have done in the past,
yes.
until the world feels like a safer place.
Agreed, yes. And that's a big challenge because how does a cinema or a concert hall or a hotel that has live music provide a safe environment
Mm.
for people who want to attend these events? And there's a need for them to rethink if they're going to survive. And maybe that means live streaming the event with a small audience in
Mm.
place and live streaming it and perhaps getting a bigger audience, a national audience rather than a local audience or even an international audience.
Yeah, it really requires businesses in all different sectors to think about what's the opportunity out of COVID, and how has the world changed, and what do I need to do in terms of pivoting my strategy and my operations to
Yes.
get a good outcome, right? Like, it's, and a lot of companies that I'm speaking to and CEOs are saying to me, Joe, I don't know what this is going to mean for me. And I get the level of uncertainty, but I suppose as a leader in a company right now, the way you pivot and the way you think differently about your consumers and your customers is going to set the business up for the best possible success that it can have, right? So understanding your customers and consumers, changing mindsets and trends, and thinking about the so what of what that actually means is kind of fundamental to any company's strategy and operations
Yes.
right now.
Yes, it certainly is. We've got to, as businesses, move on a bit from the survival mentality that we've had
Yeah,
to revival.
yeah, I like that.
And so rethink how we make that transition towards the revival. And that does require a lot of innovation for a lot of companies.
Yeah, and I think from what I'm seeing is a lot of companies are trying to grapple with making the right decision, but also being paralyzed by not making a decision at all is
Mm,
worse than making a wrong decision that you can pick
yes,
off, right? And I think that your business and what you do in terms of really understanding those consumer and customer trends is so important. I think that what Whiteark does about really understanding how the data in the businesses and how all that comes together to do the so what, and actually
mm,
helping organizations make good decisions at the moment is going to be absolutely critical. And I was
agreed.
interested on your view around advertising spend and what you're seeing in terms of, companies spending advertising or not spending advertising, and what that looks like.
Yes, well, there's certainly been a very big cutback in advertising, bigger than we've experienced during the global financial crisis. To
Yeah.
some extent, that's understandable in that some businesses simply can't get any value from advertising because they're effectively closed. But cutting back on advertising allows organisations or companies that are more optimistic than you
Yeah.
to gain market share. And we've seen that in the GFC, and we've seen it again now in this pandemic. Harvey Norman's a great example of being lucky enough to be in a business where consumers want to spend,
Yeah.
but also increasing advertising spend to gain share.
Yes.
Jerry Harvey says he's seen nothing like it in 60 years of
Mhm.
being in business. So they've got 30 to 40% comparable store sales increases. So, optimism is important and difficult, I know, but there are opportunities for many businesses by continuing to advertise and grow share now and then hang on to it as the economy improves.
Yeah. And I think, sometimes when it gets tough in a business, it's hard to know what costs you should cut and where you
Yes.
should invest, and finding this right balance between cutting the right costs to survive and get your cash flow to a position where the business is in a going concern, but also investing in the things that are going to set you up for success in the future. And I think this is this tough balance that a lot of companies are having to make at the moment.
It is very difficult. I think it is a time to make the business more efficient in an operational sense, because that can reduce costs. So that's important. We should do that. But we also do need to invest in retaining all our customers. That's very important. We must engage with them and have a good relationship with all our customers, and that's through using our data. And we also need to invest in acquiring new customers.
Yeah.
And that's through our marketing.
Yeah, and I think that, it's a lot easier to, generally in a normal economy, it's a lot easier to retain a customer than acquire a new customer.
Yes.
And a lot of companies don't spend the time and effort on that piece and really understand who their customers are and what their customers actually want. And there's a real value in being really proactive always, but at the moment specifically about holding on to those customers. And to your point, this is an opportunity where you could get a different market share of different customers who are coming in because of the current environment we're in. So figuring out how to put your advertising spend in the right place with the right messaging to get those new customers in the door.
Yes, that's very important. So understanding changing consumer needs is vital.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. And what have you seen, Charlie, in terms of supply chain disruption? And there's a fair bit of, especially early on in the COVID impact, there was a fair bit of conversation around this. But, what are you seeing in terms of your clients and your research and analysis?
I think there's been a fairly big increase in the proportion of SMEs who've been reporting problems getting supply, and that's been holding them back. I think it's about 30% who have had supply problems. Of course, a lot of them have also had demand problems, naturally, but it is an issue. Supply issues do happen for various reasons. 2011 was a very bad year for supply problems because we had some natural disasters. In Japan, there was the big earthquake and tsunami, which meant that automotive companies like Toyota didn't have enough supply. Also in that year, Australia had Cyclone Yasi, which cut back on the amount of fruit and vegetables available from Queensland. And then later on, there was a big flood in Bangkok and Honda couldn't get enough vehicles out of their factory. So these supply chain problems do happen from time to time for a range of reasons. And how we manage that is important because we can't predict when there's going to be a supply chain problem. We can't predict the timing of it anyway.
No, exactly. And look, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in the last X number of years, the whole focus around globalization, supply chain, what you can get, companies are built on the fact that it's actually easier to get things around the world, right? It's getting easier and easier. And so there's been reliance on getting things from different markets and all of that. It does bring into question the sustainability. If I'm running a company where I've got a lot of reliance on some supply coming in from another region, I now start to think about whether or not that's actually a good strategy or whether or not I need to de-risk my strategy and take some of those from other regions or other parts of...
I think diversification is quite important. We've done very well out of just in time. But there are times, of course, when that is a problem.
Yeah, exactly. I suppose it's a really interesting time for everyone. And look, I've experienced, like silly things, but like some of the drugs, in terms of medical supplies unavailable, and it hasn't been well public. Like I haven't seen or read about a lot of it in the paper, but you talk to the doctors and the specialists and they say, we can't get this particular drug, and they're not even necessarily sure why, but actually the pharmacies are really struggling to get a whole lot of the drugs that would be typical drugs into the country.
Oh, well, I hadn't heard that, but a higher profile, of course, is the fact that we couldn't get enough personal protective equipment for our health workers and of course, sanitizer as well early on. Now, fortunately, some organisations in Australia have turned themselves to manufacturing sanitizer. Distilleries, for example, can manufacture sanitizer. So as a country, we've also been too complacent about supply, including motor fuel, for example. We don't have a big enough stock of motor fuel to last us for very long. And as an island, that's a fairly important issue. So the country as a whole has got to look at the supply chain issue. And I understand that part of the budget initiative to be fully announced next Tuesday includes manufacturing industry policy to improve supply chains.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of the budget won't it? I think everyone's kind of, there's a lot of people and companies and industries very interested to see what the outcome of the budget is actually going to be.
Absolutely. Clearly, there's going to be an emphasis on infrastructure and manufacturing, which will potentially grow employment opportunities, but it doesn't happen quickly. So there'll need to be also some short-term rethinking of income support, speculation about bringing forward tax cuts, for example. So that will make a big difference to our outlook, I think, when we get the full budget on Tuesday night.
Yeah, no, it'll be very, very interesting to see what the impact is going to be on that. Look, Charlie, like I just reflect on such a big difference and change from 12 months ago. And, while maybe we didn't see it coming, and yes, we knew there was going to be a pandemic, to really see, the year 2020 will be a year that we'll all remember as being probably the year that changed things forever, right? And,
yes.
One of the big things that I'm really passionate about is really helping companies understand what the impact is of this change and how they need to pivot and how they need to change. And I think the message today is there is significant change in both consumer and customer behavior and in the economy of the whole kind of ecosystem. And it's important that actually, to your point, that people actually move out of this survival mode and they start talking about and thinking about revival. So, we've survived this period, but what do we now need to do to revive and come out of this? And you talked a bit about innovation, but really understanding what those changes have been and how does each organisation and each industry capitalise off the back of this and come out with a plan about how they're going to do things differently.
Yes, I think we also need to think in a positive way about this year, and that is that, yes, it's been very challenging, but it also provides us with a perhaps unwanted opportunity to work out how to deal with these situations, to become more resilient, and to even during these challenges improve our business, because while we will eventually get over this COVID-19, there will inevitably be future challenges. We seem to get an economic slowdown every 10 years. There may be other disease outbreaks. I think we should see this period as something of a practice run, so that we become more resilient in the future in the face of changes.
Yeah, I like that. And that, as an individual, we talk about the importance of resilience, right? And problem solving and being able to be adaptable. And so as a company is, out there trying to survive, how resilient are they? How adaptable are they? How quick did they move when this happened, right?
Yes.
And for every business continuity plan that was built and spent time on, many of them, if not a large proportion, wouldn't have been able to really have ever planned for this. And so the ability of an organisation to adapt quickly and move.
Exactly. To be agile and adapt. I use the word resilience, which is very important. The Black Swan by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. The Black Swan is the concept that something that couldn't have been predicted has happened.
Right.
Now, really, this is not a black swan because we knew it would happen one day, but we didn't know when. But he's more recently written a book called Anti-Fragile.
Right.
And the concept there is that, during a challenge like this, we can be fragile and break, or we can be resilient, that is, we can survive it.
Yeah.
The concept of anti-fragile is that we grow stronger under challenge.
Right. Yeah. So we don't just come out with, hey, we survived that. We come out stronger and more powerful.
How can we make ourselves stronger during this challenge? How can we do better than our competitors and come out of this even stronger?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting, isn't it? So
there are examples of that. I mentioned Harvey Norman before, and during the global financial crisis here, it was Hyundai who kept advertising when other manufacturers cut back on their advertising, and they gained significant market share, which they've hung on to ever since. I mean, to some extent, these come down to confidence and perhaps even a bit of luck. But we do need to think about this. When there's a challenge, when there's uncertainty, is there some way we can not only survive, but do better than our competitors by coming up with new opportunities or just being more confident when they're pessimistic?
Yeah. And I think your comment earlier around being positive, right, and optimism. And yes, there's an overlay of reality in that, but it has been a tough year. But as an individual and as a company, being positive and optimistic and thinking forward about what this means, being resilient even in your personal life, is also a really important part for companies as they navigate their people through this change, right? They navigate them through working from home, working in a different environment, and people feeling, I suppose, more concerned about the security of their jobs, right? And what this means for them is an extra challenge that companies have to think about in terms of that employee engagement piece.
Definitely. Some people want to come back to the office as soon as possible. Others don't want to come back to the office at all. So they've got to deal with, the issues surrounding the fact that we're not going to have the whole team in the office at the same time all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that I was interested for you to share with the listeners today was around this wisdom of crowds. Could you share us a little bit more about that?
Yes, it's a fascinating topic. Back in about 2004, I think it was, a chap called James Surowiecki brought out a book called The Wisdom of Crowds, and he was making the point that a group of independent people can often make better decisions than experts because they have it's like collaboration in a way. And taking that further, in a book called Super Forecasters, the author Tetlock found that some ordinary people are actually very good at prediction. And he participated in a competition which involved experts, but his forecasters were a panel of ordinary people. And the competition found that his forecasters could do better than the experts on a whole range of topics. And within his panel, he could find the super forecasters, those who very often got it right. And so I've been working with this concept for a while and asking people in surveys the likelihood that certain events will occur in the future. And these include things about the environment, like climate change, the economy, such as a rise in unemployment, and in a social sense, will there be a decline in the number of births, for example?
Yeah.
And what we're finding is that that's very useful in several ways. Firstly, the wisdom of the masses, as I call it, can predict the future in some fields, such as unemployment.
Yeah.
They predict the unemployment rate better than the economists, better than the Reserve Bank and Treasury, because they're at the heart of the labour market. They and their friends and relatives know exactly what's going on, and they see the future. And when you add up all the opinions across hundreds of people, you get a very good forecast. It's also very good at understanding what drives people's expectations about the future.
Yeah.
Firstly, expectations about the future influence their own behaviour. So if you know what people are expecting to happen, you can work towards either easing their fears about the future as a government, or as a company finding a way to leverage those expectations to your advantage. And also we find that we can identify what influences people's expectations. So a government, for example, might want to influence people's expectations about climate change. And we can, over time, identify what are the factors that have influenced people's changing beliefs in climate change. So I find it a very useful way of looking at the future, which is insightful and which can be actually used.
And, it sounds really, really interesting and makes me definitely want to go and read those books, Charlie. And I think it's important to understand customer behavior forecaster, but even more in the current environment. If people are going to, come out of this stronger, then they need to really understand those changes in behaviours and what it means for their company and how they should be pivoting. This has been so helpful and interesting and just touching the surface, actually, of all the different things that are actually going on at the moment and what people need to think about. But I really appreciated your time today and your insight and your knowledge about a lot of the different consumer and customer behaviour pieces and things to think about from an advertising perspective and business conditions and how people come out stronger and more resilient and more adapt is a really interesting and important theme. So, really appreciate you being on the podcast today. I think, I just wanted to remind the listeners that Whiteark isn't your average consultancy firm. We do think and act a bit differently, but really our two key propositions are that we use data and analytics to really drive and understand the business, to really drive a good strategy and outcome for the business. And our second value proposition is that we work with you in the trenches to deliver and execute on what needs to get done. We don't present PowerPoint packs. We actually help you get the right outcome for your business. So we bridge the gap. We help you through whatever times you're going through. But this is a really interesting time for businesses and an opportunity for them to really come out in a really stronger manner. So thank you, Charlie, for your time today, and thank you for the listeners. And hopefully you found this podcast as insightful as I did today in terms of really thinking differently about business. So thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure, Joe. The future happens to us, but ideally we can also influence the future.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. Thank you so much, Charlie, for your time.
You're welcome, Joe. Cheers.
The Chiefs.